The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. A long time ago, there lived a king and queen who were very sad because they had no children. At last, the queen had a little daughter, and the king was so delighted that he gave a grand christening feast. It was so grand that the like of it was never known. He invited all the fairies in the land. There were 7 of them, to stand godmothers to the little princess, hoping that each would bestow upon her some good gift, as used to be the custom of fairies in those days. After the ceremony, all the guests went back to the palace, where there was set before each fairy godmother a magnificent gold-covered dish with an embroidered table napkin and a knife and fork of pure gold, all covered over with diamonds and rubies. But oh no, as they sat down at table, in came an old fairy who had never been invited, because 50 years ago she had left the king's dominions and had never since been heard of. The king was much put out when he saw her. At once he ordered a cover to be placed for her, but unluckily it was only of common earthenware, for he had ordered from his drawer just 7 gold dishes for the 7 fairies who had been asked to the christening. The elder fairy felt herself slighted and muttered angry threats between her teeth. These were overheard by one of the younger fairies, who happened to sit next to her. This good godmother, afraid of harm coming to the pretty child, ran and hid herself behind the tapestry in the hall. She did this in order that she might speak last, so that if the spiteful fairy gave any ill gift to the child, she might be able to counteract it. The 6 now gave their good gifts, and they were the best that could be thought of. Then the old fairy's turn came. Shaking her head spitefully, she said that when the child grew up to be a young lady, she would prick her hand with a spindle and die of the wound. When they heard this, all shuddered, and some began to weep. As for the king and queen, they were almost out of their wits with grief. And now the wise young fairy appeared from behind the tapestry and said cheerfully, "You may keep up your spirits. The princess will not die. I have not the power to undo completely the mischief worked by an older fairy. I cannot prevent the princess pricking her finger, but instead of dying, she will only fall into a sleep that will last 100 years. At the end of the time, a king's son will come and waken her, and the two will be married and live happily ever after." Immediately, all the fairies vanished. The king, in the hope of preventing the threatened misfortune, issued an edict forbidding all persons to spin. But it was in vain. One day, when she was just 15 years of age, the king and queen left the princess alone in one of their palaces. She was wondering about when she came to a ruined tower. She climbed to the top and there found an old woman, so deaf that she had never heard of the king's edict. And she was busy spinning with a distaff. "What are you doing, good old woman?" cried the princess in her ear. "I am spinning, my pretty child." "Oh, what fun that must be. Let me try if I can spin too." She had no sooner taken up the spindle than she handled it so carelessly that the point pricked her finger. She fainted away at once and dropped down silently on the floor. The poor frightened old woman cried, "Help! Help!" And soon the ladies in waiting came to see what was the matter. They tried every means to restore their young mistress, but nothing would do. She lay with the color still in her face and her breath going and coming softly. But her eyes were fast closed. When the king and queen came home and saw her sleeping so, they knew regret was idle. All had come about just as the cruel fairy had said. But they also knew that their daughter was not sleeping forever. They knew that she would waken after 100 years, though it was not likely either of them would be living then to see her. until that happy hour should arrive, they determined to leave her in repose. So they laid the sweet princess on the best embroidered bed, in the best room, in the best of all their palaces. There she slept and looked for all the world like a sleeping angel. When this accident happened, the good young fairy who had saved the princess by changing her sleep of death into a sleep of 100 years was 12,000 miles away. But she knew everything and soon arrived in a chariot of fire drawn by dragons. The king went to the door of his palace looking very sad and gave her his hand. The fairy condoled with him and approved of all that he had done. Then, as she was a very sensible and prudent fairy, she suggested that the princess, when she awoke, might be a good deal put about, especially with a young prince by her side, and finding herself alone in a large palace. So, without asking anyone's leave, she took her magic wand and touched everybody in the palace except the king and queen. She ended with touching the little fat dog who had laid himself down beside his mistress on her splendid bed. He and all the rest fell asleep in a moment. The very spits that were before the kitchen fire ceased turning, and the fire went out, and everything became as silent as if it were the middle of the night. The king and queen, having kissed their sleeping daughter, left the palace, and in 1/4 there sprang up about it a great wood, so thick and thorny that neither beast nor man could go through it. Above this dense forest could only be seen the top of the high tower where the lovely princess slept. A great many changes happened in the 100 years. The king and the queen died, and the throne passed to another royal family. And the story of the poor princess was almost quite forgotten. When the 100 years were at an end, the son of the reigning king was one day out hunting. He was stopped in the chase by the thick wood and asked what wood it was and what was the tower was that he saw above the tops of the trees. At first, no one could answer him, but an old peasant was found who said that his father had been told by his grandfather that in this tower was a beautiful princess who was doomed to sleep there for 100 years, till awakened by a king's son, whose bride she was destined to become. When he heard this, the young prince determined to find out the truth for himself. He leaped from his horse and began to force his way through the wood. Wonderful to relate, the stiff branches and the thorns and the brambles all gave way to let him pass. And when he had passed, they closed behind, allowing none of those with him to follow. The prince went boldly on alone. The first thing he saw was enough to frighten anyone. Bodies of men and horses lay stretched on the ground, and the silence was truly awful. Soon, however, he noticed that the men's faces were not as white as death, but had the color of health, and that beside them were glasses half filled with wine, showing that they had gone to sleep drinking. He passed then through a large court, paved with marble, where rows of guards stood presenting arms, but they were as still as if cut out of stone. Then he passed through many rooms where gentlemen and ladies, all in old-fashioned dresses, were sound asleep, some standing, some sitting. At last, the astonished prince came to an inner room, and there was the fairest sight he ever saw. A beautiful girl lay asleep on an embroidered bed, and she looked as if she had only just closed her eyes. The prince went up to her and knelt down beside her, and I'm not sure, but he kissed the lovely princess. The end of the enchantment had now come. The princess wakened at once, and looking at him with the sweetest look, said, "It is you, my prince? What a long time I have waited for you." Charmed with these words, still, and more with the way in which they were said, the prince told her that he loved her already more than his life. "And I love you quite as much," said she. "How often have I dreamed about you during the last 100 years?" For a long time they sat talking, and it seemed as if they never could have said enough. In the meantime, all the attendants, whose enchantment was also broken, not being in love like their mistress, felt very hungry. The lady in waiting, out of all patience, ventured to tell the princess that dinner was served. Then the prince handed his beloved princess to the great hall. She did not wait to dress for dinner, being already perfectly and magnificently attired. Her lover had the politeness not to notice that her dress was so long behind the age that she appeared exactly like a portrait he had seen of his own grandmother. What did it matter? She was so beautiful. During dinner, there was a concert by the attendant musicians, and though they had not played for a century, their music was exceedingly good. They ended with a wedding march. For that very evening, the prince and princess were married. The bride, of course, was nearly 100 years older than the bridegroom, but she looked really quite as young. The prince carried the princess to court, and in time the two ascended the throne. And they lived so long and happily together